As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
Don't you love it when things are both easier and more affordable? Like when the rain washes your car for you. Or like when you save up to 10% by bundling your renters and auto insurance with USAA. Bundle with USAA and start saving. Get a quote today.
The NBA playoffs are here, and so is the Athletic NBA Daily. Need a fresh, fun take on last night's action? We've got every dunk, buzzer beater, and game-changing play covered. Join Dave DeFore, Zena Keita, and Esperahini Monday through Friday for fast recaps. And join me and Alex Spears Saturdays for Saturday Slam and Jam with playoff trivia and some big-time vibes. All the playoff intel you need, faster than your morning coffee. Listen on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you pod. We're there.
The Athletic. Hello and welcome to And Colossally That's History, the podcast that reappraises motor racing history. I'm Matt Bishop, and I'm joined in the studio by my good friend Richard Williams. How's it going, Richard?
It's going very well, thanks, Matt, and I'm happy to be back in the studio talking this time not about Enzo Ferrari, as we did on our first 2 episodes of Season 3, but about another titan of the Formula One grid, Frank Williams. I say we're going to chat about Frank Williams. Actually, this episode is not about Frank's life story as such, but about one of the defining years of his life, 1986.
Yes, indeed. And as we sit here today, in early April 2025, Williams, the team Frank Williams founded in 1977, are a mainstay on the Formula One grid and one of the most successful teams in Formula One history, having amassed 9 Constructors' World Championships, 7 Drivers' World Championships, and 114 Grand Prix victories. But it all could have been so different.
It could indeed, and although they're showing signs of a very decent revival at the moment, the Williams F1 story might well have ended very abruptly in 1986 when Frank Williams had the devastating road accident that confined him to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. But Frank fought on. He fought for his life, and he fought for the future of his team, with his incredible wife, Ginny, and his doggedly determined business partner, Patrick Head, alongside him all the way. In this episode, we'll tell the tale of that remarkable year, which of course ended with one of the most dramatic, indeed explosive, title showdowns in living memory.
Absolutely it did, yes. It's a remarkable story, as you say, Richard. And I suppose we should start by setting the scene, because heading into the 1986 season, Williams were firmly established already as an F1 powerhouse. The team had won Constructors' World Championships in 1980 and 1981, and Drivers' World Championships with Alan Jones in 1980 and Keke Rosberg in 1982. And in 1983, Frank had done a deal to run Honda engines. And in 1985, a year after the team had upgraded from working out of rented industrial units, I think it was a former carpet warehouse, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. They had moved into new premises on Basil Hill Road in Didcot. And the team won 4 Grand Prix in 1985, Nigel Mansell and Keke Rosberg winning 2 apiece. For 1986, Nelson Piquet was recruited in place of Rosberg to lead the team on a deal worth just over $3 million, plus bonuses, which was a hell of a lot of money 40 years ago, and backed up just how much Frank believed in him. Williams had arguably the strongest driver lineup on the grid at that time, Piquet and Mansell. They also had brilliant Honda engines. Everything was looking very, very good. But let's just go back a little bit, if I may, or if we may, before we dive straight into 1986. Frank had loved cars from childhood, but he first properly fell in love with them, cars and speed actually, in 1959 at the age of just 17, when an older friend took him on a apparently very rapid joyride in his Jaguar XK150, the 3.4S version, which is, or was, the hot variant, powered by a 3.4-litre triple-carb double overhead cam straight six, good for 250 bhp. I do love my classic cars. Teenage Frank was hooked on speed ever afterwards.
Yeah, he'd had a rather choppy childhood. His dad, who flew Wellington bombers in the war, had left the family soon after Frank was born in 1942. Frank was sent to a Catholic boarding school in Scotland, while his mother worked as a head teacher at a school outside Nottingham. He was good at languages, but he spent most of his time reading motoring magazines, like a lot of us. His first job was as a trainee with a vehicle distribution centre in Nottingham, living with his mother, earning £3 10 shillings a week. And before long, he persuaded his mum to give him 80 quid to buy a souped-up Austin A35, with which he started racing. And when he rolled it at Mallory Park one day, he got out of the upside-down car and encountered another young driver, also a Williams, Jonathan Williams, who'd crashed at the same spot.
No relation, of course.
No relation.
No.
But they got talking, and back in the paddock, Jonathan introduced Frank to his pal Piers Courage, the son of the chairman of the Courage Brewery. Piers was an old Etonian with a wide circle of racing-mad friends, and soon Frank was becoming absorbed into their number. And after being sacked from his first job, he worked briefly as a petrol pump attendant, in the days when such things existed, and as a sales rep for Campbell's Soup, a job that, in the early 1960s, apparently required him to wear a bowler hat.
Amazing how things have changed, isn't it?
Anyway, he was now racing an Austin A40. He'd moved up. And he'd moved into a flat in Harrow in northwest London, which was a place that became a centre for a bunch of racing friends that included not just Piers Courage, but another lot of public school boys who'd go on to make careers for themselves in the sport. Charles Lucas, Bubbles Horsley, later of Hesketh fame, and Charlie Crichton Stewart, who'd one day work for Williams. Frank was beginning his own career as a wheeler-dealer in motor racing, buying and selling cars and bits of cars, and by 1966 he'd moved up to racing at Brabham in the European Formula 3 Championship, and that was a lot of fun, charging around Italy and France and living on starting money.
Yes, indeed, and let's make clear, Frank was nippy, quick even, actually, but to be really honest, he conjured much of his speed from his fearlessness. When it came to skill, finesse, he soon realised, how can I put it, he didn't have quite what it took to compete with the really fast guys, you know, the consistently and effortlessly fast men. So he soon gave up racing and tried to be a mechanic. But he was even worse at that.
So he gave up being a mechanic too and started running a team at the tender age of 24.
Amazing, really, 24,
Isn't
team
it just?
boss.
Even younger than Christian Horner.
There you are, yes.
His first win as an entrant came when Piers Courage won an F3 race in Frank's Brabham in 1968, followed by a win for Jonathan Williams in the same car at Monza. In 1969, Frank and Piers, very ambitiously, moved up to F1, again with the Brabham, and Piers took a remarkable second place at Monaco and $20,000 in prize money, extremely useful to Frank, who never had any money at the time.
Exactly.
Behind Graham Hill's Lotus. And for 1970, Frank made a deal with another wheeler dealer, Alejandro de Tomaso, an Argentinian man about racing. I'm sure you remember his name.
I do. And his cars.
And
his road cars.
His road cars, beautiful road cars, the Pantera.
Pantera,
Yep.
etc.
De Tomaso had based himself in Modena and had started making road cars and racing cars. Frank ran a De Tomaso designed by the young Gianpaolo Dallara. They didn't finish any of the first 4 Grand Prix, and in the 5th, at Zandvoort, courage crashed when something broke on the front of the car. It was either the steering or the suspension, and he ran wide and hit a bank. The car overturned and caught fire. He was trapped in the cockpit, but he'd been hit on the head by a flying wheel, and he died instantly.
Awful.
Terrible. One of many, many deaths around that time.
Of course.
He was good, Piers Courage. He'd actually been offered to drive by Ferrari, and Frank was hugely upset by the death of his close friend. But he carried on, and the driver's widow, Lady Sarah Curzon, told Maurice Hamilton, Frank's biographer, that Piers would have been horrified if Frank had given up. For the next season, Frank entered a march for Henri Pescarolo without much success. And a year later, 1972, he and Pescarolo turned up at Brands Hatch for the British Grand Prix with a chassis designed by Len Bailey called the Polytoys, in deference to its sponsor, who'd provided £40,000. I like Maurice Hamilton's verdict on that car. Quote, "It wasn't just late, it was almost not worth having," unquote. Pescarolo qualified near the back and wrote the car off during the race.
Probably the best thing to do with that
Yep.
car. Anyway, these were the years in which Frank was in an endless battle with bailiffs and bank managers. In fact, he was so broke that he did business from a public phone box, didn't he?
He did.
And he cadged lifts and sometimes even cash from journalists. Imagine a team principal borrowing money from journalists. Anyway, for goodness sake. Anyway, he was known to his friends, and not his enemies, because he didn't really have any enemies, but he was known to his friends as, well, this is a family show, so how can I phrase this? Not banker Williams, although he was in hock to many bankers, but a word that rhymes with banker Williams.
Oh, go on, Wanker Williams.
Wanker Williams. Okay, we'll say it. Wanker Williams. Anyway, when he got married to Ginny in 1974, he had to borrow £8, not very much money, even then, for the licence, but he had to borrow it. And when the team couldn't afford new tyres, his mechanics would go to Goodyear and find some old ones that Ferrari had discarded, but still had just a little bit of tread on them. He once borrowed, I love this story, he once borrowed £5,000 from Bernie Ecclestone. And he went back to see him a few weeks afterwards, Frank this is. He presented Bernie with a cheque for the £5,000 in repayment. Then, as soon as Bernie had pocketed the cheque, Frank asked Bernie if he could borrow £7,000.
And of course he would have got it.
He would have got it.
And that came in useful in the end because, Bernie knew he could rely on Frank when he had to, when there was, a political battle going on.
No flies on our Bernie.
No. Anyway, over the next 4 years, he had some very decent drivers, including Jacques Lafitte, and very gradually moved towards respectability. Partway through the 1976 season, Frank sold 60% of the team to a man called Walter Wolff, a Canadian who'd made a fortune in the oil business and had also bought the assets of the Hesketh team. Frank now had Harvey Postlethwaite to design the cars from Hesketh and Jackie Eakes to drive one of them, but none of it helped, and there were barely any finishers, never mind points finishers. And at the end of the season, Wolff brought in Peter Waugh from Lotus as team manager. Frank discovered that he'd been demoted to the job of finding sponsors and chauffeuring Walter Wolff around, and he decided to walk away. The silver lining, and a very good one, to that disastrous episode was that he began his partnership with Patrick Head, who'd been designing racing cars for various small teams and building boats, when Frank took him on as Postlethwaite's assistant. And when Frank started his new company, he offered Patrick a 30% shareholding. Frank and Patrick, they were a proper couple, weren't they, in racing
legendary pairing, really.
They both recognised something in the other, a deep passion for racing and an absolute no-bullshit attitude. They also recruited some brilliant helpers, Ross Brawn, who could make bits and drive the truck and was just starting out, and Neil Oakley, who joined as a junior draftsman.
Both of whom, of course, went on to have long and very successful careers.
Become incredibly illustrious figures in the Formula One.
Indeed,
paddock.
indeed.
And Frank and Patrick also found something Frank had never experienced before, a sympathetic bank manager who'd just taken over the Didcot branch of Barclays. He came to visit, and Frank was actually hiding behind the filing cabinets. but when this chap told the secretary what a racing fan he was, the secretary went and persuaded Frank to come out, and they had a very nice conversation. And the bank manager offered Frank the use of a £30,000 overdraft facility. And this was a man who not long before had been overdrawn to the tune of £140,000.
Very interesting point, isn't it? If that bank manager hadn't been a Formula One fan, what might have happened? Or if loans had been awarded in the way they are now, it might have been a case of the computer says no.
Yes.
And that might have been the end of Williams.
There would have been no bank manager visiting an industrial estate in Didcot anyway.
Absolutely not.
So now, anyway, for Williams, the pieces were all in place, and they led very quickly to the team's first Grand Prix win at Silverstone in 1979.
And I was there. Were you, by the way?
I was not at that one, no.
You were not at that one, but I was there, age 16, watching Clay Regazzoni win for Williams the British Grand Prix. His last Grand Prix win, and Williams' first. As you say, Richard.
Yeah, Regazzoni was a bit of a hero of mine.
Bit of a hero.
I liked the way he went racing.
Absolutely. He was 40 odd at that point, I think.
Yeah.
I think he was 40 or as near as damn it 40.
Yeah, I had the T-shirt, an early bit of merch. I think very nice, the Clay Regazzoni T-shirt. Might still have it somewhere, actually.
Well, you should wear it next
fit
recording. You no longer fit it. As I say, I was 16, and I remember watching Regazzoni on the podium that day spraying Lilt. Lilt, the fizzy pineapple and grapefruit drink, because Williams' Saudi sponsors wouldn't allow him to spray champagne. Does that qualify as an anorak fact, Richard, would you say?
Champagne. I'd call that a vintage anorak fact. And that Silverstone win was soon followed in 1980 by the first drivers and constructors titles for Alan Jones and Frank Williams, and then by a second constructors title in 1981 and a second drivers title in 1982 for Keke Rosberg, as you mentioned. So now Frank's team really was up there with Brabham and Lotus, McLaren, Tyrrell, even Ferrari. And Patrick Head was being acclaimed as one of the great designers of the era.
Yes, and rightly so, because Patrick Head was and is a technical genius. And after a couple of so-so years, the car he oversaw for 1986 as the Williams team's technical director was the truly brilliant Williams FW11 with its super punchy 1.5-litre turbocharged Honda V6 engine. I say Patrick oversaw the design of the car, and he did, but credit should also go to Frank Durney and Sergio Rinland, who worked with him on the car's design.
Well, at that time, we were beyond the era of one person designing everything on a Formula One car. It was taking a team, really.
Absolutely, yes. It was beyond the auteur era. From a film director type of analogy. Anyway, the Williams chassis was good and the Honda engine was great. Easily one of the most powerful in Formula One at the time, if not the most powerful. So all in all, it was a great car. And Williams were rightly one of the pre-season favourites for 1986, along with McLaren, who'd won the previous year's World Championship with Alain Prost, Lotus, who had a young and hungry Brazilian driver called Ayrton Senna at the wheel of one of their cars, and of course Ferrari, who were a kind of a bit all over the place in this period, as we discussed in the last episode when we were talking about Enzo Ferrari, but had performed pretty well with Michele Alboreto the previous year, 1985, I mean. So the first round of the 1986 World Championship was to be held in Brazil at the end of March at the Jacarepaguá circuit in Nelson Piquet's hometown of Rio de Janeiro. But before that, then, as now, the Williams team had to go testing.
Yeah, and the FW11 was quick straight out of the box, which is always a good sign. And as was common in those days, Williams had chosen the Paul Ricard circuit at Le Castellet in the south of France, with its better-than-average chance of decent weather, as the destination for the final pre-season running before they all went off to Brazil. And such was the team's standing by this point that Goodyear, their tyre supplier, had agreed to pay for every one of the team's laps during the sessions. So the more laps they ran, the more money they got. And for someone like Frank, who, as we've said, had struggled to raise money so much before, this was a glorious situation to be in.
He must have been well delighted with that.
I think so.
Yeah.
Keep the cars out there.
Yes.
And in his personal life, Frank was also well beyond the days of bounced cheques and bed sitters. In her extraordinarily poignant memoir, which was first published in 1991, Frank's wife Ginny talks about the reward of Frank's hard-won success being the fact that they could finally afford to buy a house rather than being stuck in a cycle of renting places. In fact, they'd recently bought a small mansion for themselves and their 3 children, Jonathan, Claire and Jamie, in the countryside near Newbury, and they were doing it up. Anyway, Frank flew into France on Saturday, March the 8th, and it was literally going to be a flying visit. See the team, watch the car, say hi to Nelson and Nigel, meet a few sponsors, and then fly back later that evening, as he was intent on running the Portsmouth Half Marathon the very next day.
Yes, it might actually perhaps surprise some listeners who've only ever really known Frank as a wheelchair user that he was at one time extremely fit and very sporty. In fact, according to his wife, Ginny, running was, next to motor racing, his biggest obsession, which must have made losing the ability to run all the more difficult for him. Frank particularly enjoyed the challenge of long-distance running and middle-distance running, and the opportunity it afforded him to unwind and think. In 1986 alone, he was running about 70 miles every week, which is about 110 kilometres, and doing a half marathon every third or fourth week. And for any runners who may be listening, he'd run that half marathon, which is 13.1 miles or 21.1 kilometres, in about 80 minutes, which is very respectable indeed. And all of that while running a Formula One team at the same time. In fact, in the 70s, there had been a thing called the Grand Prix Running Association, which was a charitable initiative in which the Formula One drivers and the fitter Formula One personnel occasionally ran a lap of whichever circuit they were racing on that weekend for charity. James Hunt and David Purley often did well because they were particularly fit drivers, drivers who incorporated plenty of running anyway in their fitness programs.
Astonishing to think that James Hunt had a fitness program,
well,
wasn't it? Other than the obvious.
Well, I think he his pelvic muscles would have been.
Okay.
Shall we stop that? Anyway, where were we? Well, the funny thing about James Hunt is that, of course, he was a playboy, and we don't want to get, sidetracked too much about that, but he actually did like running, and he was a fit guy. Yeah. But although, as I say, Hunt and Purley were both fit, they rarely beat Frank, who was not only the only team boss who regularly took part, but he also won most of the races.
Yeah, Frank loved running, absolutely, and running fast. But another thing he enjoyed and always had, perhaps ever since that joyride in the 3.4 Jag you mentioned, XK150, when he was 17, was driving fast. Although by 1986 he hadn't actually raced on a track for 20 years, such was his competitiveness that he apparently used to keep a stopwatch in his car to time his regular drives from Didcot to Heathrow and back.
Not a good sign.
Not a good sign. At the end of the day of testing at Paul Ricard, he phoned Ginny and told her that he was off to the airport and he'd be home for supper. She was cooking pasta so he could load up on carbohydrates ahead of his run. Then he climbed into his rented Ford Sierra hire car with your good friend, Matt, the journalist turned Williams PR, Peter Windsor, in the passenger seat, and they set off for Nice Airport. It's about a 90-minute drive from Ricard to the airport, and the first part of the journey was notorious in F1, as people like to put their foot down on the winding B roads before reaching the autoroute. Frank was by no means the only person in F1, particularly at the time, to drive too fast on the road, was he, Matt?
Indeed, he wasn't. Driving hire cars, rental cars, flat out, was a thing almost everyone in Formula One did back then. Drivers, team personnel, journalists, photographers, particularly photographers, I seem to remember, but basically everyone. I wouldn't say we used to race one another, well, not per se, anyway, but how can I put this? We used to drive as fast as we could in convoy. It wasn't sensible, and it isn't the done thing nowadays, even among Formula One folk, and rightly not. But it was a long time ago, and the past is another country, as they say. Anyway, here's a quote from Ginny Williams' memoir. Quote, Frank was always involved in minor skirmishes in cars, usually as a consequence of employing race driving techniques on public roads. She continued, quote, I recall years earlier Frank walking into the house with Jacques Lafitte, both of them with bleeding heads, and Jacques, not the most easily frightened of racing drivers, declaring, fucking awful driver, I'll never drive anywhere with him again. And by the way, there are stories about Jacques Lafitte and his own harem-scarum driving on the roads, but no one was more harem-scarum than Frank. Anyway, so Frank had got away with incidents before, but this time he wouldn't. About 15 minutes into the journey, near the village of Méun-les-Montreux, Frank swept around a left-hand corner, and the car, just a normal Ford Sierra, remember, began to slide. He tried to correct it, to catch it, but it was too late. He'd lost control. The car swung one way, then the other, tank slapper, then it nose-dived down a drop before somersaulting into a ploughed field. It landed upside down, with the left front corner of the roof collapsing and pinning Frank below. But of course it was a left-hand drive car, this being in France. In a heartbeat, Frank's life and the fate of his beloved racing team had changed forever.
And that feels like a good time for our first break.
Still getting around to that fix on your car? You got this. On eBay, you'll find millions of parts guaranteed to fit. Doesn't matter if it's a major engine repair or your first time swapping your windshield wipers. eBay has that part you need, ready to click perfectly into place for changes big and small. Loud or quiet, find all the parts you need at prices you'll love. Guaranteed to fit every time. But you already know that. eBay. Things, people, love. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
I'll start part 2 with a quote, if I may. Here goes. Quote, there was a smell of fuel, and Frank was saying, get me out of the car, get me out of the car. We were upside down. The roof had collapsed. Our briefcases were open. There was stuff everywhere. And although we had our seatbelts on, we were tangled up in those seatbelts. Frank was saying, I can't move my legs. I didn't know if he'd pinched a nerve or what had happened. I tried to pull him out by the armpits while cradling his head rather than pulling him by the neck or whatever. That's about all I knew about what to do as I dragged him out of the back of the car. Someone had seen the accident, had kicked in the remnants of the rear window, and had removed the shards of glass. As he lay on the ground, I remember Frank saying, I'm never going to drive fast again. Well, that's the end of that quote, and those powerful words were the words of Peter Windsor, my friend, as you say, as described to the journalist Maurice Hamilton in his terrific Williams book, Maurice's terrific Williams book, which we'd urge you all to buy, wouldn't we, Richard?
We would indeed, yeah.
Now, as I say, Peter is a good friend of mine still now, and obviously it was a traumatic experience for him. I've talked about it with him quite often, and I remember once saying to him, just imagine how much worse it would have been if you'd been driving and Frank had ended up tetraplegic as a result of a driving error of yours, not his. He couldn't answer. He was silent. Well, it doesn't bear thinking about, does it? But although Peter was never a racing driver, other than, he did do the odd pro-am and charity event when he was younger, but he was never a racing driver. But Peter absolutely was and is a racer in spirit. Absolutely. Par excellence. In fact, I think I'd safely say I don't think I know anyone who loves racing more than Peter does. So, yes, he was upset by the event. Of course he was. But he coped. He thought that, racing and driving fast and all those kind of things has its dangers, and here was a result of one of those dangers.
Yeah. In Ginny Williams' memoir, she talks in chilling detail about the moment Peter called her from France to tell her that Frank had been in an accident, and the grim hours that followed as she and Patrick Head, who'd come over to her house, were waiting for further news, not having any idea of whether he'd just given himself a bang on the head or it was something much worse. And at precisely 8 o'clock the next morning, Bernie Eccleston phoned, telling Ginny and Patrick that it could be bad, and telling them to come to France. He offered his private jet, but it turned out that a scheduled flight from Heathrow would be the quicker way. They were met at Marseille Airport by Nelson Piquet and Frank Durney, and they travelled together to La Timone Hospital, Marseille's university hospital, where they met Nigel Mansell and Peter Windsor, who'd spent the night there. Professor Sid Watkins, the Formula One medic, a distinguished neurosurgeon, he was also there, having arrived in Bernie's jet. He introduced them to a man called Professor Vincentelli, the head of neurosurgery at the hospital, who'd already operated on Frank during the night. Ginny, Patrick, Peter and Nelson Piquet were all in Vincentelli's office as he described how he'd taken a bit of Frank's hip bone to graft onto the broken vertebrae in his neck. This was the first they'd heard anything about a broken neck, and they were all stunned. Ginny remembered that Piquet, who was actually sitting on top of a filing cabinet in the office, started weeping. Ginny pulled herself together enough to ask, "Is he paralysed?" And Vincentelli nodded.
It's almost like a scene from a movie, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Terrible thing.
Terrible. The drama and tragedy in those moments, extraordinary. Anyway, in her book, and we unashamedly lean quite a bit on Ginny's book because it is so excellent. In her book, here's how Ginny described the moment. She eventually went to see Frank, bloody and swollen, in his hospital bed. Quote, "Have they told you that I'm paralysed?" Frank asked. Haltingly, I told him that I thought they had said it was a possibility. There was a long silence. Hot tears streamed down my face. Frank watched me, dry-eyed. He was so much braver than I was. As I fought to control my sobs, he spoke to me again very clearly. "Ginny, as I see it, I've had 40 fantastic years of one sort of life." He paused and stared at me, unblinking. Then he said, very slowly and deliberately, "And now I shall have another 40 years of a different kind of life."
And that's what Ginny called her book, A Different Kind of Life. And let's be very clear at this point. Without Ginny Williams, the Williams F1 team simply wouldn't exist today because Frank Williams wouldn't have survived. The doctors at the French hospital expected him to die, and it took huge persistence on the part of Ginny, helped by Peter Windsor and Prof. Watkins, and by an anaesthetist who'd been flown out from London, to get him released and flown back to the UK by air ambulance, where he was admitted to the Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel. He might even have died on the plane home, so bad was his condition.
And of course, Sid Watkins worked at that hospital, didn't he?
Yes, he did indeed.
Yeah.
Frank spent the next 12 weeks in the hospital, where he needed constant attention and monitoring. Ginny was there almost around the clock, watching as his lungs were constantly drained and learning how to use a catheter as the extent of the impact of his injuries became apparent. The fracture had come in the spinal column between the 6th and 7th vertebrae, the precise location of a broken neck, determines how many physical functions will be destroyed. And that one meant Frank would be a quadriplegic, unable to use his legs or his lower arms, and with impaired or non-existent command of pretty much everything below his shoulders.
I think we've used the term quadriplegic and tetraplegic, but I think they mostly mean the same.
I think they do.
Yeah.
It's a horrifying story and often a very harrowing one. But there are moments of humour, like the one where, when Ginny hears Frank muttering deliriously in his sleep, what he says is this: "Tell Mrs. Thatcher I've left it under the hedge." Well, Mrs. Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister at the time, was actually one of the first to call after the accident and offer her sympathies, so props to her. And others who provided practical support included your old boss, Matt, Ron Dennis.
Yes, and I will say Ron was always very fond of Frank. Along with Ken Tyrrell, the two of them stood up to Max Mosley and Bernie Ecclestone quite a few times, to their disadvantage often, and they did that in their attempt to advance their own advantage for their own teams. Sometimes that worked, sometimes it didn't. Their teams being Williams, McLaren and Tyrrell, yes. But also to stick up for what they genuinely thought was right and proper. Ron and Frank were particularly close. Ken was older, of course, and his team was in decline, whereas I think in the 1980s and 1990s, Ron certainly regarded Williams as an organisation worthy absolutely of as much respect as he thought his own team, McLaren, had earned and therefore deserved. Also, Ron was always enormously impressed, almost in awe, in fact, I think I could say, of Frank's extraordinarily phlegmatic and astonishingly stoical stiff upper lip. The way he kept buggering on, as Winston Churchill famously put it, despite being a quadriplegic. Frank was a great patriot, of course, and a big admirer of Winston Churchill and of Margaret Thatcher, who you mentioned earlier. Shortly after a general election, I remember this, shortly after a general election one year, perhaps it was 2001, perhaps 2005, I told Frank I'd voted Labour. He looked at me with absolute scorn. He really wasn't a socialist.
No, he wasn't. And I have to say, I was always a bit surprised when he agreed to be interviewed by The Guardian, which was the paper I was working for at the time. I always thought he was looking at me, slightly sceptically. What's this?
He could probably cope with the sports pages of The Guardian, but not the front few pages.
But, we were all commies. Anyway, Frank's physical fitness, which we've talked about, his running and his half marathons and so on, that certainly helped him to pull through. But there's another moment of black humour in Ginny's book when, having helped to save his life, she almost kills him. He's in the London hospital, being fed through tubes. There's a danger that anything he takes in by mouth will go into his lungs rather than his stomach. And it's already happened once, and they noticed it when he started turning black. So Ginny has a bright idea. She goes out and buys some boiled sweets to rub on his lips and give him some flavour. That'll be okay, the duty anaesthetist says, so she goes and gets some. She puts one in Frank's mouth and another in hers. 5 minutes later, he's going black again, and with great difficulty, gobbets of boiled sweet are retrieved from a lung.
My goodness.
At that point, Sid Watkins arrived and is told what has happened. He's furious. He can't believe it. "I will personally castrate the person who's responsible for giving Frank the boiled sweet," he bellows. Well, but as we've said, it was Ginny who'd kept Frank alive, and her job was a long way from finished.
I loved Ginny Williams. What a wonderful woman she was, and much missed now, of course, because she died in 2013, before Frank did, in fact. She was brave, clever, but also possessed of a wonderful sense of humour. She used to love it when Peter Windsor and I used to tell her funny stories about what was going on in the Formula One paddock. And she used to laugh like a drain if the butt of our jokes was her husband. That wasn't because she didn't love Frank. On the contrary, she absolutely loved him very, very much. But because she never took herself too seriously, and that natural levity and humility she extended to Frank as well. Anyway, going back to 1986, as Frank fought for his life in hospital, his team carried on doing what they always did, and what Frank would no doubt have wanted them to do. They raced. And, after all, as the saying goes, the show must go on. In Frank's absence, Patrick led the team to victory in Brazil, Nelson taking the honours, and the news of that Grand Prix victory is said to have provided an important psychological boost for Frank in his recovery. I can certainly believe that would have been the case. And I think here we should say something about Patrick. Williams was called Williams, but it was founded by not only Frank, but also Patrick. And Patrick was a shareholder from the very outset. And the work that Patrick did as technical director was absolutely central and absolutely crucial to the success of the team. And now, to be fair, Frank was always very diligent about heaping credit on Patrick for his monumental contribution to the magnum opus that Williams was and would become. But never was that contribution more important than in the period immediately following Frank's accident.
Yep. And just 12 weeks after the accident, Frank returned home to continue his recovery. Part of their house had been turned into a virtual medical unit with all the facilities needed to support his return to whatever would be his new normal in terms of health, including a backup generator for all the gear in case of power cuts and 2 permanent live-in nurses.
Actually, just worth saying here, Frank once said to me, "I'm very lucky. And if I wasn't personally wealthy, it might have been a lot more difficult for me. And there are other people who are disabled in the same way as I am, who aren't as wealthy as I am, and I feel sorry for them."
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. And the same would be true of Michael Schumacher subsequently.
Absolutely.
So it wasn't just that Frank would be unable to walk or hold things. He had to learn how to eat and drink and even breathe in a new way, since he couldn't expand his rib cage, which is something we do with every breath without thinking about it. And in Ginny's words, quote, "For the rest of his life, he'd be unable to cough, to sneeze, or to laugh. That last loss, that of laughter, hit me harder than the others," unquote. And if you read the whole book, including her account of their relationship from its start, you'll understand exactly why.
Absolutely.
2 days after returning home, he was taken to the factory, where he was greeted by 60 people who, when they were told of the accident 3 months earlier, must have feared it would mean the end of the team and of their jobs. And they gave him a standing ovation. Ginny had driven him there, and there's a funny moment in her description of that day when she remembers him barking at her after only a couple of miles. "For Christ's sake, Ginny, can't you drive any faster than this?"
I can imagine her thinking, the one thing I'm not going to do is drive fast in a road car on the road, Frank.
Yep.
Yeah.
But of course, he hadn't been to a circuit for 3 months, and in his absence, tension was starting to boil up between his 2 drivers, not least because, as team principal, he was the one who mediated between them. Patrick Head looked after Mansell, and Frank Durney did the same for Piquet. But the referee wasn't on the pitch when things got heated.
Yeah, well put. Piquet and Mansell were both great drivers, no question about it. But both were also difficult characters. They both won races in 1986, Piquet 4 and Mansell 5. But as a result of their rivalry, and because they both raced well and therefore both took points off each other, 1986 will go down in history as one of those Formula One seasons in which the team that won the Constructors' World Championship, in this case Williams, who won it by a long way, in fact, didn't also get to see one of its drivers become world champion. And that was because over at McLaren, it was Alan Prost who did all the winning that year. He won 4 Grand Prix, but his teammate Keke Rosberg won none at all, and therefore took no points off Prost. That was a bit of a surprise, actually, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Because obviously Keke had shown himself to be a great driver.
Yeah, everybody thought he was super fast. And,
but world champion only a few years before.
Yeah.
And the truth is, well, in my opinion anyway, that's how Formula One World Championships are most reliably won, by great number 1 drivers ably supported by good number 2 drivers. By the way, I described Piquet and Mansell as great drivers but difficult characters, didn't I? That they were. But controversy alert, Mansell was just an awkward guy, prickly, paranoid, easily upset, great driver, but all of those things too. But PK? PK was and is something rather different, a genuinely nasty man.
Well, it's certainly hard to forgive him for insulting Mansell's wife and making snide insinuations about Ayrton Senna's sexuality, as he did several times.
And also making, more recently, nasty remarks about Lewis Hamilton, including racist remarks.
Yeah. And Frank would get the chance to experience the tension between his drivers at first hand at the next round, when he made an emotional homecoming at the British Grand Prix at Brands Hatch in July. We'll tell you all about that after the break.
Were you at the British Grand Prix in 1986, Richard? I wasn't.
Yes, I was, as a spectator rather than a journalist. Actually, I always preferred Brands Hatch to Silverstone as a venue for F1 cars. There's much more variety of corners, changes of gradient and camber. It's a different kind of challenge.
I always thought the same, to be fair, yeah.
And I bought tickets for that race close to the front of the stand, between the start line and Paddock Bend, so I was well placed to see some of the most dramatic moments of the afternoon.
Yeah, it was Frank's homecoming. Bernie had arranged for him and Ginny and his carers to be flown to Brands. It was the first time most people had seen him in a wheelchair, and he was given a standing ovation, again, in the media centre. He was there for the practice sessions on Friday and Saturday, but his doctors thought it would be safer for him to stay at home on race day and watch the action on television, although he and Patrick persuaded Ginny to go and represent him. And what a race it was, wasn't it, Richard, right from the start?
Yeah, it certainly was. Nelson was on pole with Nigel next to him, with Senna's Lotus Honda and Gerhard Berger's Benetton BMW behind them. It was a 26-car grid throbbing with turbo power. There were Alfa V8s, V6s from Honda, Porsche, Renault, Cosworth and Motori Moderni, remember them?
Just about remember them, yes.
And straight fours from BMW and Zaxpeed, all in front of a crowd of 120,000. Nigel, who'd been given the big build-up by the British media, broke a drive shaft in the first few metres after the start. But very quickly, that wasn't what people were watching. On the approach to Paddock Bend, right off the start, the first corner, something broke on Thierry Boutson's arrows, and he turned sharp right into the barrier and bounced back into the path of the midfield. 5 cars were out on the spot, and the race was stopped. Unfortunately, one of the cars involved in the pile-up was Jacques Lafitte's Ligier, and the 2 broken legs he suffered put an end to his career on the very day he was matching Graham Hill's record of 176 Grand Prix starts.
Horrible accident for poor Jacques. And what a lovely guy, of course.
Yeah, it happened about 50 metres away from me, actually. And,
really?
Yeah, and I was with my wife, who was a big Jacques Lafitte fan and was very upset.
Yes. Well, he was quite a bit of a heartthrob back in the day, wasn't he?
Oh, certainly, yes.
Yeah.
So she tells me. Anyway, it took an hour to clear up the mess and restart the race, and Mansell's car couldn't be repaired in time. In those days, the teams were allowed spares, and on this weekend, it was Piquet's turn to have that spare Williams set up for him, although Mansell had also tried it on the Friday. So now he jumped into it and proceeded to go fast enough in a car set up for Nelson to win the race. He actually followed Piquet for 20 laps or so, but then he took the lead from him and stayed ahead when Piquet tried what would now be called the undercut and went in for a tyre change ahead of his teammate. I remember the crowds cheering when Mansell came out after making his own stop 2 laps later and, on cold tyres, dramatically holding off the Brazilian. I hadn't heard a cheer like that at Brands Hatch since Clay Regazzoni took his Ferrari past Jackie Stewart on the main straight to win the 1971 Race of Champions.
How about that?
Yep. So Mansell and Piquet at the front swapped lap records until Nelson realised he wasn't going to prevail and settled for second. And I like very much what Mike Lawrence wrote in his motorsport report. Quote, "We all know that Nelson Piquet is one of the very best drivers, a thoroughbred, and that dear old Nigel is a plodder, a big-hearted Shire horse who does everything by grit and willpower. it's perhaps time that we revised that opinion.
I think people were a bit unfair about Mansell back in the day because he was, as I've said, an awkward bugger. But he was also a very skilled driver with a lot of finesse, not just big balls.
Yep.
Do you agree?
Couldn't agree more. And what I always liked about him, he was one of those drivers who, when he got in a car, his first instinct was to look for somebody to overtake.
Yeah.
And, he was a moaner. We'll probably do a podcast about Red 5 one day, and we can discuss all these things.
It could even stretch to a two-parter.
It could.
Not a Red 5-parter.
Very good.
Anyway, back to Ginny. She was indeed there to see Nigel take the checkered flag, and she accepted the winning constructors trophy on the podium too, which, it wasn't the kind of limelight she enjoyed at all, but she did it for Frank and for the team. Team Willie, as she and Frank always called it, and because she knew it was the right thing to do.
There's a great quote from Patrick Head in Maurice Hamilton's book talking about the rivalry inside the team in 1986. Quote, "The car was quick, and in a Grand Prix team, that papers over all sorts of schisms and problems," unquote.
Very good quote, actually.
But not always does it do that. And it all boiled up again in Hungary when Piquet won after keeping quiet about a special differential that gave his car much better performance through the slow corners. Mansell, who finished more than a lap down in third place, claimed that he hadn't even been told about its existence. And that had led to a shouting match between the two drivers after the first practice session, when Mansell realised how much slower he was. And Frank had to listen to them both complaining about the other. Frank Durney, who was running Nelson's side of the garage, said that Piquet's view of the special diff was, "There's not much in it." But he would say that, wouldn't he?
Indeed so. Anyway, on we go with the season, and Prost won in Austria, Piquet won in Italy, and Mansell won in Portugal. And actually, talking of Portugal, here's a brilliant story from Portugal, Estoril, as told by the Williams mechanic Steve Coates and quoted in Maurice Hamilton's excellent book. Quote, "In 1986, the Honda had unburned fuel collecting in the exhausts. It kept flashing but not exploding. In Estoril, it got worse, unbeknown to us. The car had been sitting between practice and qualifying. Les Jones, another mechanic, started it up and there was an explosion, like a flamethrower. It spewed out flames and knocked Frank out of his wheelchair. He banged his head on the floor. Les came off even worse because he was bent down. Frank was directly behind him. As a first aider, I started on Les straight away, and as soon as the medics arrived, and they were tending Les obviously, I went to check on Frank. And there he was, back in his wheelchair, wheeling around the garage, singed hair and a bit red in the face, like he'd got rouge on. But he was having none of it. It was like nothing had happened. And this is me again now, and that was typical of Frank, stiff upper lip again.
Yep, totally. And so the season continued. It was a championship that seemed to be being contested between the two Williams drivers in a car that was demonstrably the class of the field. Although in Mexico, in the penultimate round of the 16-race series, there was a bit of a blip when Mansell fluffed the start, and he and Piquet could only finish 5th and 4th, respectively. Alain Prost had been collecting second and third places, as well as 3 wins to 4 apiece for the Williams drivers, and his 6 points for second in Mexico set up a tense 3-way championship finale. How did it all work out, Matt?
Well, we all know what happened, don't we, Richard? Mansell took the pole, but he messed up his start, dropping to 4th. So Piquet was leading the race. However, surprisingly, because Rosberg hadn't had a great season, Rosberg, then overtook Piquet and took the lead for McLaren. Then, bad luck for Keke, he suffered a puncture on lap 63 when he was looking like he was going to win the race, handing the lead back to Piquet. But Mansell was third now, which would have been just enough for him to win the World Championship. But then, disaster. 1 lap later, Mansell's race ended when his left rear tyre punctured on the main straight. Now, Are you going to say what Murray Walker then said on TV, or am I?
Oh, be my guest, Matt.
Well, okay. Well, Murray said, no, make that yelled, and colossally, that's mental. And that is why the podcast to which you're now listening, dear listener, is called And Colossally, That's History.
Boom, boom.
There you go. But seriously, although everyone at Williams was absolutely gutted because Prost ended up being world champion for McLaren, ultimately their achievement, Williams' achievement, winning the Constructors' World Championship in the same year as their founder and boss had almost died, then spent months fighting for his life, ending up tetraplegic, has to go down as one of the all-time great Formula One recoveries. Right up there with Niki Lauda in 1976, I reckon.
Yep. I remember going to see Frank in his office at the Grove headquarters about 20 years ago. It was the longest one-to-one chat I ever had with him, and what I remember isn't anything in particular that he said, but the keenness of his intelligence, the sudden flash of his smile, and the glint of those green eyes.
That's extremely well put, Richard, if I may say so. Frank had all those things, even in his wheelchair, and although his voice was impaired by his disability, so he kind of whispered rasped. I think he rasped as a result. His intonation was always energetic. And he used to swear a lot too. Do you remember?
No, I don't remember that. No. And looking back on his accident late in his life, he'd smile and say, "It was inconvenient, wasn't it? But, you know, if this were the Moral Maze on BBC Radio 4 rather than your favourite motor racing history podcast, we'd probably be debating the justification for all the hugely expensive and resource-consuming medical treatment poured into the survival of a man who'd caused his injuries purely through his own irresponsibility, as he'd have been the first to admit. But then we'd have had to balance that against the fantastic degree of determination that enabled him not just to survive as an individual, but to continue to provide employment to hundreds of people doing jobs they loved, as well as offering encouragement to others trying to cope with literally crippling injuries." What do you say, Matt?
Well, look, we all make mistakes. And for me, personally, I won't hear a word said against Frank Williams. And I know you weren't saying a word against him, you were just asking the question. But yes, when it came to the resilience of the human spirit, Frank was a multiple world champion. Absolutely. And if I may tell you a nice story here, perhaps it's a little-known fact that one of the reasons why Frank lived on for more than 35 years after his accident was that he remained a fitness fanatic despite his disablement. He was incredibly careful about his diet. He was determined to remain lean in spite of his immobility, and he never used sophisticated and expensive motorized wheelchairs, for instance, but always persisted with a modest and above all light model that he had to propel himself, because don't forget, he had some movement in his arms, if not in his hands. So every day he'd go for a push, as he used to describe it, an exercise that required enormous effort. And almost to the end, he used to instruct Williams' travel clerks to book him into hotels whose corridors and lobbies had wood or lino flooring, where he could go for a push, energetically weaving his way through the lines of people waiting to check in or check out. I remember it many times. Carpets were no good to him because his wheels would dig into them, obviously rendering going for a push impossible. And where no such hotels were available because the areas were carpeted, he'd improvise, sometimes intrepidly. One evening, I can't remember what year, but anyway, having driven back from the Hungaroring to the Kempinski Hotel in Budapest, I remember pointing my hire car into its underground car park, and I nearly ran Frank over. He was going for a push down there in near darkness, all on his own in the evening. I screeched to a halt. I lowered my window, and I apologised profusely. Frank responded with an impish grin, the impish grin that never left him, and rasped, And here's a little impersonation, but delivered with love. No problem. That was a fucking good bit of braking. Stiff upper lip again, eh?
Yeah. If he'd had the full use of his hands, he'd have made a demon Paralympic athlete.
Oh, he would.
There would have been no stopping him.
Absolutely right. Anyway, what a man. What a hero. Sir Francis Owen Garbutt Williams, CBE, died on November the 28th, 2021, at the age of 79, having become the world's oldest surviving tetraplegic at that point, I believe. He'd lived a truly remarkable life, especially when you consider that his doctors hadn't given him a hope in the period immediately after his accident. And as I said earlier, Ginny died in 2013 of cancer, aged 67, and she spent the last 27 of those 67 years looking after Frank. What a woman. What a heroine.
And that feels like a good place to say, and colossally, that's history. And to wrap up our episode on Williams' remarkable 1986 season, on and off the track.
But before we go, it's time for our new questions section, where we answer a handful of questions from the Race Members Club about the topic of our previous episode, which in this case was Enzo Ferrari.
Yeah, and the first one comes from a long-time listener to the podcast, Simon Ems. Thank you, Simon, for this question. Could Enzo Ferrari have avoided all the political machinations and had more success before his death if he'd attended races? It always seems that by having trusted lieutenants, trusted in quotes, in command, they missed out on a lot of the success that the garagiste teams had. Or is that just historical revisionism?
Well, I think that's a very good question from Simon Ems, and I think the answer is yes. I think that because the lieutenants weren't only trusted, they were also cowed. They were also frightened, and they were reluctant, therefore, to tell Enzo Ferrari what was really going on. And if he had been there more often, or ever present, as was the case with most of his rivals, team principals, then he would have understood and learned and been able to oversee what was going on with a rod of iron, which ultimately he never really had the information to be able to do. And let's also say, which I think is a salient point, it would have been very exciting and good for the media and good for the fans to see Enzo Ferrari in the paddock, duking it out with Bernie Ecclestone and Colin Chapman and later Ron Dennis, etc. But we never got to see that.
No, and we wouldn't have had the legend of the man in the dark office with the dark glasses either, would we?
We wouldn't, to quote Jodie Scheckter.
Yep, indeed.
Our second question, which is from another member, Davy Coolan, as follows. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the dalliance Enzo Ferrari reportedly had with Ayrton Senna in the middle of the 1980s. Apparently they met while Ayrton was at Lotus, but Ayrton asked for too much money. I've read somewhere that Enzo called Ayrton, quote, a forbidden love, end quote. Ayrton and Enzo, what a story that could have been. It's a good question, isn't it? It
is a very good question, and apparently there were contacts at the end of the 1986 season, and Ferrari wanted him for 87. It would have been really, really interesting, but, Senna was a shrewd guy. He was a bit like Fangio. He was careful about where he went for the coming season. He wanted to be in the best car that would give him the best chance. And so he decided to stay with Lotus for that 87 season. And then, of course, he went on to McLaren, which was a very good move indeed. What would have happened? Well, he wouldn't have had long with Enzo, of course, because Enzo died in 1988. And it's very clear, there's no doubt, that the old man rated Senna extremely highly. And then Senna, shortly before his death, after Enzo's death, Senna did say to his girlfriend that he wanted to end his career at Ferrari. Kind of they all say that, don't they?
Well, it's an interesting point because, of course, Senna died when he was 34. And another multiple world champion who thankfully has lived much longer than that and hopefully will live to a ripe old age, Lewis Hamilton, did finally join Ferrari, but at the age of 40. And who knows whether Senna might have done that had he lived.
Yeah, indeed. It's the same impulse, isn't it? It's a really interesting thing, all part of the Ferrari legend.
Absolutely. That wraps up our first ever members' questions section. But remember, we're planning a special members-only questions episode at the end of this season of the podcast. So if your question on Enzo Ferrari wasn't answered on this episode, we might still get to it later on.
And if you'd like to ask a question, just head to patreon.com/therace and sign up to the Race Members Club. It costs about the same as a cup of coffee each month, and you'll get all of the Racers' shows, including ours, ad-free, plus bonus shows and loads of other benefits.
And if you don't have a question for the show, but you'd still like to drop us a line, you can get in touch via podcasts@the-race.com, or you can drop us a line via social media. I'm at the Bish F1 and Richard is at rwilliams1947.
So that's it for this week. Until next time, with thanks to our producer, Johnny Reynolds, and thanks to you for listening, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
And Colossally, that's history.
The Athletic.